welcome to our webinar today. The aim of the webinar really is going to be looking at Marikana, where we are now 9 years after the actual massacre. Have the people of Marikana received justice? Are they happy, or have they received redress? And we'll also be looking at issues of memorialisation. So I guess with issues of Marikana, they're very close to all of us. I think in the post-apartheid South Africa, nobody was expecting to see such scenes that we were seeing on our TV screens. So it's one event that really hit us, that shook the nation, that up to today, it's a memory that we really cannot forget. And unfortunately for the many people in Marikana, they still feel like justice has not been served. Let me just give a quick overview of today. We have 3 speakers whom I'm going to give 15 minutes each to give their presentation. We're gonna allow all 3 of them to give their presentations. Then at the end, I will allow for a 5-10 minute question and answer, whether you are asking for issues of clarity, some additional information, or you want to just give a comment, I will allow for that. But most part of the day later on, I really want us to spend time really brainstorming on what else can be done, especially looking at civil society organizations, what are areas that we can collaborate in Marikana. So hopefully we'll spend much time there. Before we start, I just want to give an overview of the work that CSVR has done over the years in Marikana. We've been in Marikana, I think, just since the massacre, really. I think like many other organizations, like many other individuals within the country, we were just as shocked at the scenes that we were seeing on our TV screens. So then CSVR allowed staff members to travel to Marikana to really go on a fact-finding mission to try and understand what are some of the dynamics, what has happened, and more than anything, how it has impacted on the community of Marikana. And one thing, when we got there, you could see the shock that the people had. Like you could really see collective trauma. There was high levels of mistrust, especially for people that did not come from Marikana. So they wanted to associate, who are you, what are you here for, and that. And it's very unfortunate that 9 years since the incident, the people of Marikana still feel like that. They're still demanding for answers. They're still demanding for people to be held accountable. They're still even just pleading and asking for an apology, which they have not gotten. So it's a very sad situation in Marikana. So maybe let me explain some of the interventions that we had. We started by identifying key people in Marikana that we thought we could give them capacity to be able to offer psychosocial support to members of the community. We gave them training, and then they called themselves Tsepotemba. They were there to really offer containment, emotional containment, to offer psychosocial support to the members of the community. They were not only limited to that, they also offered psychosocial containment to the widows as they were going into the Falam Commission, to really just give them the necessary support that they needed. There have been a number of healing interventions that we've tried out in Marikana. At some point, we even opened it up for people who had really been tortured and people who had gone through torture during apartheid, just to make sure that we can really deal with some of the root causes and really deal with some of the issues around trauma in Marikana. We also had a project that was really looking at issues of peace building within Marikana. And with the issues of peace building, it was really looking at issues of social cohesion, which was a problem. I think even before the massacre, there were issues around social cohesion of who is the rightful owner of the land of Marikana. There were those tensions within the community. And there were issues, I think, also coming from the massacre. There were also issues around the community did not trust the police. I think for a number of years after the incident, police officers were not allowed to come into Marikana. And as a result, we had high levels of crime, right? And with the high levels, as the community was battling and trying to deal with issues of high levels of crime, they took the law into their hands. And there would be issues around mob justice. So there were really a number of things that were coming. And when we went there 9 years ago, there were really like people, the socioeconomic conditions, people lived in shacks, they had no access to water, no access to electricity. And sadly, 9 years since the massacre, not much has really changed in Marikana. And this is really very sad. And I'm just talking about some of the interventions that we've seen and some of the information that we have been able to get as we work in Marikana. So I'm gonna allow our next speaker, who's going to be really looking at the interventions, legal interventions that she has done since the massacre. I'm going to start with Nomzamo Zondo. She's an executive director for Socioeconomic Rights Institute of South Africa, shortly known as SERI. She joined SERI because of the opportunity to work with the exploited communities. I guess here you really realize the type of person that she is, as somebody who really fights for social justice. In her, she's trying to really use the law to balance the scale of social justice. Nomzamo works mainly on housing rights cases and defending communities threatened with evictions and litigate for provision of basic services to informal settlement. Nomzamo was involved in the Marikana Commission of Inquiry and continues to act as an attorney for the family of the deceased members. I am going to now give over to Nomzamo to talk about her work and if really the community that she works with feel like they have attained some kind of justice, or how far is the process. Over to you, Nomzamo.
Thank you so much, Sulu, and thank you to CSVR for inviting us to participate in this webinar. So SERI is, as you've rightfully pointed out, SERI's involvement with Marikana started with our legal representation of the families of the deceased. And in preparing for this presentation, I really went back to those first few weeks in our interaction when we were still preparing for their participation in the Marikana Commission of Inquiry. And I'm hoping to take people through what their hopes were at that time and what they've been able to see, what has in effect been realized and what hasn't been. And a lot hasn't been realized, as you pointed out. And just to start, I want to go back to the words of Unandipa Kunuza, who's the widow of Bomkosi Yona. I think it was in around October 2012. And she said to us, I want to know who's responsible for my husband's death. I blame the police. I blame lawmen for taking their workers for granted. The police should know better. They cannot solve a situation by killing people. Where was the tear gas, the rubber bullets? I blame them all. I'm a widow now because of them. And one of the key things that the families spoke to us about in those first few weeks of our interaction was the truth. They wanted to know exactly, they wanted to know the exact events that led to the killings of their loved ones. They wanted to know why the police intervened in what was in effect a labor dispute, and in the end ended up killing their loved ones. They wanted to know what their loved ones had done wrong. Many of them are saying, why didn't they just arrest them? Why didn't the employer just dismiss them? Why were they killed? And I remember one of them said, I want the commission to find out what happened that day. The police are people that are respected and trusted in society to protect us. Why did they shoot people who had a wage dispute with their employer? But the reality is that while they grieved for their loved ones, the state machinery was at work to paint the miners, both those who died and those who survived, as a violent mob that attempted to kill them, that attempted to attack the police. And in this long journey, so in fact, from the get-go, the families come into an environment where they are being told there's going to be a commission of inquiry. In fact, the promise from the Minister of Justice that this commission of inquiry will bring some relief to them, will bring them justice, will bring them truth. But as they start their journey in the commission of inquiry, they spend about 2 to 3 days listening to the legal representatives of the police, who paint these miners as violent and as brutal killers. And I want to quote, I think, Colonel Fisser, who spoke at the commission while he was presenting the police's theory of the case. And he said, nobody was spared by the violent nature of this group. Not co-workers, not mine security, not mine supervisors, not even police were spared. And when the police opened, in the police's opening statements, I think it was on the 3rd day of the commission, their senior counsel, who advocates Menya, says, he gives a guarantee, he says, at no stage during the situation did the SAPs premeditate loss of life and injury as an unstoppable end game. But in the same, within 3 or 4 lines, he says the protesters intended a bloodbath. So he says the miners had walked into the situation intending to kill someone. But in terms of the truth that the families were able to uncover from their participation in the commission, they learned that even though the miners are claimed to have prepared themselves for a bloodbath, not a single policeman had a scratch. No policeman had been injured on the 16th of August. And in fact, in the opening statement, the police say, we have proof about this miners' violent intent because one of our nyalas, one of the police vehicles, the police canters, has bullet marks on it. Within our legal team, we joked about how there's the wounded nyala. So how the case that we have to meet is how our clients or the loved ones of the families of our clients had wounded this nyala. But on the other hand, we know that 34 people died that day. 78 were injured, and over 200 were arrested. And all of this had happened in a situation where hours before, at around 8 in the morning, the police had called the Department of Health and said, we need 4 mortuary vans here, 4 mortuary vans that could carry 32 bodies. At that time, they spoke to Netcare and ordered ambulances. On the same day, they ordered thousands of rounds of live ammunition. But what we then know is that despite what their intention was, on that day, 48 police officers discharged their firearms 305 times in 12 seconds. And in that 12 seconds, 17 lives were taken. Another 295 rounds of ammunition were discharged in a different scene, which most of the public didn't know about until, again, journalists brought it forward. And again, it became a common knowledge in the commission that there was something that was called Scene 2, which the country had not seen. But again, there in 11 minutes, 17 people died in Scene 2. And again, this 300 rounds of ammunition had been shot by 57 police officers. And this is the truth that the families could carry. And this is important because when they came into the commission, they came and said, we've been hearing out there in the public that our loved ones have nobody to blame but themselves. But standing in the commission, Noma Kepu Msebetsane, the sister of Chavis Msebetsane, said, now that I'm here at the commission, I can see that the workers were fighting for a living wage. They just wanted a wage increase. The theory that they don't want to blame for themselves, it's only just a lie. And it was, they invested over 300 days of their own lives in the Marikana Commission Inquiry, But even then, not enough truth came forward. So that I think by almost a year and a half after the commission's report had been given to the presidency, they learned of new things. They learned that of the 34 people who died, in the commission, they'd been told that one of them had died in hospital. But in fact, no, Mrs. Khala didn't die in hospital. He died in the back of a police van with his hands tied to his back, while other workers watched as they cried for the police to stop and make sure this person gets medical assistance. And this they learn not in the Commission of Inquiry. They don't even learn it in official letters from the police, from IPID, from the state attorney who represents the police, but they learn it through their engagement with journalists, Greg from the Daily Maverick. And again, unfortunately, the truth, they continue to uncover the truth, is even as we sit today, for most of this, for about 6 weeks of this year, they've sat in criminal prosecutions related to the people that died on the 13th of August. I'm very, very sorry, I feel bad that I didn't even explain that SERI represents two groups. Well, we represent one group, which is known as the families of the deceased of Marikana, but that group has 3 families whose loved ones were killed on the 13th of August, and 33 of 34 that were killed on the 16th of August. And they've learned in the process of these prosecution about the fact that the 13th was indeed the seeds of a massacre. They've learned about how 1 second could have changed not only their own lives, but our country's history, about how the decision by the police to use tear gas on minors who were simply running towards the copy meant that on that day, 5 people died. And we believe that started the massacre, because on the 16th, when the police came to the mountain on the 16th, they came with fears, and they came with anger about the 2 police officers they lost on the 13th. Though in the very same vein, minors had lost trust in the police, because on the 13th, they'd asked the police to accompany them to the copy, and 3 of them had been killed, and another 6 seriously injured. But one of the things that SERI in our work has tried to do is to show who were these minors, because early on the narrative was just to say this is just a mob. You can't see any individuals. And Umama Balitu Bachijase, whose son Akuna just died at the massacre on the 16th of August, said in 2012, said, I want the commission to know that I lost a son during the strike. I want someone to take responsibility. So in our work, we've struggled and pushed for people to know the people who died on those 2 days in August. There were sons, there were husbands, there were fathers, there were brothers, there were friends, but also there were youth, because 13 of the men who died in that 37 were young, people who were under 35, and at least with the youngest of them being 23. People still maybe don't know that they were Christians, that they were leaders, that they were soccer players, because the strike was discussed in the soccer games. They don't know that some of them coached the soccer teams of their villages in the Eastern Cape, and even here in Sasolburg. But the most important thing is, because the minors are gone, there's been a question of what's happened to their families. What does the killing of their loved ones on the 16th mean for them? And for the families, for the last 9 years, they've missed the role played by the deceased minors in their lives, both emotionally and financially. And in our work, we've tried again to show what that has meant, in not only showing South Africans who the minors were, but who are the family members they've left behind. And one of the key things that even today we continue to fight about is whether Marikana is a tragedy or a massacre. In preparing for the commission, in preparing what at that time we called the family's application, which was what the families wanted to say to the commission, Notfenoki told us as the legal representative, and something that we told the commission. She said, I want the commission to discover the truth. I want to know why government killed the workers. If the police work for the government, then government kill them. Why lawmen did not opt for other options, like giving the workers a wage increase or dismissing them? I've never heard of workers getting killed by police over a wage dispute. She said, why was my brother killed? And I want to know how my brother died. And many people, I think, have also heard how her brother, who was seen as a key figure in the strike, was brutally injured with over 23 wounds on his body after he had died. And these are things that the families were able to firstly get from the commission, but also proof of why they feel this wasn't a tragedy. This was a massacre. When they put together the injuries on their loved ones, when they put together how the police acted before the massacre, and they put together how the police acted after the incident, their only conclusion can be that this was a massacre. This wasn't a tragedy. And as Sari, we knew that even though we are lawyers, it would be important for us to ensure that history records what happens correctly. We knew that we had to produce a counter narrative of what happened. And in doing that, we wanted people to be able to have an objective view of what happened in the massacre, not only in the 3 years that were in the commission, but in 20 years' time. And we knew what we were building. We're building a record that wasn't just about now, but a record that would be about how this incident is recorded in history. As an example, as part of our work as SERI, we have in our website a document that explains who these miners were, where they came from, how their death affected their families, who their families are. We collaborated with the History Workshop to have a website that has all the exhibits that stood before the commission. Unfortunately, the commission had a website, but that website has been dysfunctional for years. People who are still interested in finding out about the commission, even hearing reading the direct evidence, that is available in SERI's website, in the website that we produced together with the Vets History Workshop. And then in our work, we've also done two things that allow people to have a glimpse of what the massacre meant for our clients. There is two short films. One of them is Imbogodo, The Widows of Marikana. And then there is another one, which is called Bringing the Truth Home, which follows us to 7 villages in the Eastern Cape, and two meetings, one in Butabote and another which is in Lesotho, and another one in Sasolburg, where we were mandated by the families to take the commission's report to their communities. And they said to us, we want the people that we live with to know what the commission found, because where we come from, we are still vilified as the family members of people who attack the police. And we want people who are even close to us to really hear, not only from us, but from you as our legal representatives and from the surviving miners, what really happened in August. Were the miners wrong? And if they were, was the way their lives ended fair? And so that process happened in 2015, and out of that, we produced Bringing the Truth Home. But one of the key things from early on, and I'm reminded about why we've been so grateful about our engagement with CSVR, is that our clients were taken aback about how their loved ones had been killed. In 2013, we went through a process of taking them through the postmortem of each miner, and we had in that group 4 or 5 people in each family, and we were supported by CSVR to make sure that there's counseling before the briefing on the postmortems, and then they also gave them support after we'd spoken to them about the postmortem. And one of the widows, Umamu Udiao, she said, I want to know how it came to be that my husband was killed in such a cruel manner. And I want to know what would happen to those who killed him, which for the families, they felt assured that the justice system would respond, that those who killed their loved ones would be criminally charged. But it took about 6 years, close to 6 years, for the first policeman to appear criminally charged for events related to Marikana. And there were two cases. One of those cases I think I've spoken earlier about both cases a little bit earlier, which was about, one was about the fact that the police had covered up how and when Mrs. Khalala died. And despite the NPA and the families following up on this criminal prosecution, the policemen who were charged for trying to hide the circumstances related to Mrs. Khalala's death were acquitted in March of this year. And the rationale was that why would the police cover up what the whole nation already knew? But what the nation doesn't know, and we speak to many people who are not close to Marikana, they still tell you about the violence of the miners. They do not know about the vindictiveness and the attitude of the police. Because I imagine that if Mrs. Khalala was fatally injured, the policeman who arrested him, he would have told him, I'm injured, I need medical attention. People don't know that someone like Mwaninze died from bleeding. He bled to death. And that if in that first hour after the shootings in the first scene, he'd been given medical attention, he would be here today. But the court found that it doesn't make sense. The police had already owned up to killing him. Why would they hide how he died? But in this year, as I've explained, the families have continued to follow the criminal prosecutions related to the 13th. And in those criminal prosecutions, there are 6 police officers who are charged. And those 6 police officers are charged. The first one is charged because he gave the instruction to throw the tear gas that started the chaos. And that tear gas, on his instruction, was followed by stun grenades, and which created utter chaos, which in the end, so many people died and another 6 people were injured. And if, as we said, for us, we know that split second, when he decided to give that instruction, he changed so many people's lives. But now, most importantly, in that case, outside of him, there are 5 policemen who are charged for having killed one of the miners who had managed to run away from the chaos, who was at least 600 meters away when he was shot by people who were far from him. So he was in effect assassinated, and 5 police officers are being asked to account for his death. It's the one thing that of course is worrying is how we know that from the get-go, after the massacre, on the very next day, the miners that have been arrested, 279 of them, were charged for killing the 34 who they had been running with on the 16th. And I don't think there's a better way to encapsulate what that means, especially if you look back and say now 9 years on, has the NPA even charged 20 policemen for what happened in Marikana? And they haven't. And also Samek, I said, I want to know what the police's job is. Is it not to arrest people? Why did they kill people like my husband? Is it the law in this country that when policemen kill people, they shouldn't be brought before the courts of law? Because if these people had killed any other people or the police themselves, they would have been arrested. Or is the law partial? And what she says, it's so profound, because we know that not only did we have 279 people charged in 2012, we know that in 2015, another 17 people were charged for the deaths, for the 7 deaths that are outside the miners that happened in that week. And that prosecution has been followed by the NPA to this day. Whereas on the other hand, we only have these two cases in relation to the families. But we also know that the NPA has simply not put aside enough money or enough resources to make sure that people account for what happened in Marikana. And I'm worried about time, Tulu, so I hope I have like 3 more minutes to really just speak on one thing that has come up a lot in the last month, which has been the issue of compensation, to the extent that government even came and had a press briefing. For the first time, where the government briefed the country on what they've done in relation to Marikana. And they said, look, we've paid so much money to these families as reparations. With Andres, who will speak later, my colleague, and I shared about how they're in short accusing us of not having paid this money over to the families. And we know that in the families that SERU represents, about 71 million was paid to 34 or 36 families that we represent. But in those 34 families, I wanted to be clear that 71 million meant for some very, very little. And when I say very, very little, I mean there's a family that was paid 125,000 rand as compensation to replace the income that the person who died would have earned. Interestingly, the person who died wasn't a striker. He had gone to bring somebody lunch on the 6th of August and ended up being killed by an R5 bullet so many, I think over 400 meters away from where the TRT was. But his family got a measly 125,000. And now the Solicitor General and the Solicitor General can say, we compensated them. Why are they still crying? But the real problem with the issue of compensation is that the state hasn't paid any money for the non-financial loss. And the non-financial losses have been many. Just the pain that the families have borne has at times even been multiplied. We know that at least in 2 families, they grieved twice within the month of August 2012. For one family, a sister to the deceased miscarried. Another family, the mother fainted on hearing the news, the Sokanyile family, and when after she fainted, she was rushed to hospital, but died on the way. And when they buried, there are 2 coffins instead of 1. But the losses have kept on coming. At least there's been 2 instances where the children of mine workers have committed suicide. In one case, it was reported that this was partially because of incessant bullying from other children in the school and even teachers and people in the hostel that the child went to. Those losses included for the families having for the widows to move away from their homes in rural Lesotho, in rural Eastern Cape and come and work at London so that they could make sure there was food on the table. The massacre happened in August 2012, but the first payment of compensation from the government was in August 2018, a full 6 years. And in the 6 years between that, the widows survived on, and as someone said, the grace of God, the empathy of people. And sometimes they just simply survived by scrounging off members of the families that remained. And it's been hard to engage a state that's really not interested in repairing the damage that it's done. And one of the things that's been even more difficult, as I close to, has been how a lot of money is returned on Marikana. A lot of money is returned on Marikana from the commission itself. And I want to be clear, the families do not regret participating in the commission because they feel that they've been able to amass information that they wouldn't have without the commission. So they appreciate that investment in making sure that truth is accessible to them and that they can pass it on to other people. They know that money has been spent to defend the police that are charged for killing the miners on the 13th. They know that more money will be spent to defend the other police who will be charged for what happened on the 16th for the deaths of the 34. But they know they learned this month that 5.5 million had been spent in litigation representing Ria Pierre, who wanted to challenge the findings of the commission. So while they cry for compensation and are told that they must accept 500,000 per family, the state's purses has been open and has been running to support those who are on the wrong side of the massacre. And so in the things that they've asked for, as Tulu mentioned earlier, they asked for an apology. But for the last 6 years, there hasn't been any real response. At some point, I think it was in 2017, there was an indication that the minister is considering addressing the widows. We know that President Ramaphosa, at some point addressing students at Rhodes, said he wants to go and apologize to the families and wants to go to Marikana. And the families responded head on and said, if you want to apologize to us, you must come to our homesteads. And please don't scream about the apology in public platforms elsewhere. Come and speak to us in an intimate space so that we can see that you're sincere. But even as we see today, they really struggled to engage the government on just those 3 things: the truth, criminal accountability, and compensation. But the one thing that's important, not only for the families, but all of us as African citizens, is a guarantee of non-repetition. How do we know today that we will not have another massacre tomorrow? And unfortunately, the answer is we don't. We know this because the police were as brutal dealing with students in March of this year and killed someone who wasn't participating in the protest because they haven't learned the lessons of Marikana. And even though we have the panel of experts report on crime management and policing, we haven't really seen a willingness to take that report seriously. We haven't seen the minister make it policy. We haven't seen the civilian secretariat for police services tell us how they're going to make sure that report is implemented. Even worse, we don't have a state memorial to recognize that incident. And I'm saying both in terms of a physical monument, but also in terms of even a public holiday, which AMCU, the families and the surviving miners have repeatedly called for. And I'm just to close now for real. I'm just going to address why it's so important to have that recognition. We have public holidays where we recognize the injustices of the past. We will recognize the wrongdoing of the apartheid government. And if we are a country that's really committed to the constitution and the vision that it espouses, at the very least, we should have a moment or at least a place where we make our commitment that never again will something like this happen. Thank you so much, Sulu.
Thank you so much, Nomzamo. I think you've really given a very comprehensive presentation. I think for me, you've really brought to life, right? You've really spoke on behalf of the deceased to say that they were brothers, they were fathers, they were coaches. These are people who were very important to their families, very important to their friends, who had so much to still contribute as young people. So thank you for really bringing that into the conversation. I'm gonna now hand over to the next speaker, Andres Nkome. Andres Nkome is he comes from Nkome Incorporated Attorneys, and he was among the very first attorneys to arrive after the massacre to assist the arrested miners with criminal prosecutions. He was there in the Falam Commission. He's been part of different litigations. Some of them ended up at the Concord. I think he's been there in the inquiry that looked at the fitness of Ria Pierra. There's so much that he has done from the beginning. I really will not want to give his full bio. Hopefully, as he gives his presentation, he will be able to get to know him more, and he'll talk about some of the work that he's done. I'm gonna hand over to you, Andres. I am not so sure if we can hear you. Can other people hear?
No, we can't hear him. We can't hear you, Andres. Try again.
Oh, okay. We still can't hear you. You know what? I'm going to suggest that you possibly leave the room and then come back in. And then in the meantime, I will hand over to my colleague, Hugo. Can you try speaking? And we still can't hear you. I think just leave and then come back again. That might be able to assist. And then in the meantime, I will give over to Hugo to give his presentation around some of the work that he's really been doing with the community, really in trying to talk about issues of memorialization. Over to you, Hugo.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Tsolofelo. Yes, as you can see, I'm not Modiegi, who was on the program to present. I'm afraid he's ill today, so I'll step in to the best of my abilities. And I think just to briefly share with you that this work that what I'm presenting today is kind of just ongoing research that CSVR has been doing in collaboration with international partners. Just to mention, it's Swiss Peace and the University of St. Gallen. On a project, it's an international project looking at corporate accountability and how corporates engage with symbolic reparations in relation to human rights abuses. And it's sponsored by the Swiss Network for International Studies that has supported this research. And just to quickly kind of share with you, I think some of the broader issues that we've picked up from the research, where we're trying to unpack all of these different processes that are happening simultaneously. And I think it's important, and as you've already seen, this is a complex issue involving a whole range of different victims and community dynamics that have kind of that go much broader than the direct victims involved. So I think that the tricky thing here is we're building on a foundation, we're trying to build on a foundation in Marikana where there's unresolved apartheid-era human rights abuses. And that's emblematic of the broader mining sector, where our Truth and Reconciliation Commission started to kind of uncover some of the legacies of the exploitative mining practices, the migrant labor system, and so on, but did not call to account any perpetrators, the state for their policies, or the mining companies who were sometimes directly implicated. So there's a legacy of mistrust and lack of truth and a lack of honesty about that past that we still need to come to grips with as a society. And then on top of that, there's also the changes that have happened since 1994, where reforms in the mining sector have improved some issues, particularly around labor rights. But in terms of mining ownership and the politics of how the unions operate in mines has in some ways actually worsened and destabilized mining relationships and created kind of collaborations between the state or between certain state actors and mining companies that have created mistrust and undermined the way that we deal with conflict, which is inevitable in these contexts, but has made it difficult for those to be contained. Then it's also important to understand that Marikana residents live in a very violent context, where police have now become part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And in Marikana particularly, there's an ongoing and a deepened mistrust of policing. In a community where violence has become more widespread, where violence, as we've heard, there's incidents that is domestic violence, there's different factions within the community that are at odds with each other, and where the police is unable to do its normal duty and in fact is seen as a structure that cannot be trusted. And that's within a context where policing at a national level is also still struggling, where public order policing reforms have not been introduced as recommended by the Farlam, by the committee set up through the Farlam Commission. There are also many direct and indirect victims of the ongoing multi-layered Marikana conflict. Essentially, that we have in some families who were so directly affected by the massacre and by the deaths that preceded the massacre. But that process hasn't stopped. As we've heard, there have been further murders that are being politically connected in Marikana, and further people who've died because of suicide. Essentially, it's a traumatized community at so many levels. And that trauma has also created mistrust and then inability in many ways, of collaborative efforts to take off because of the lack of trust. And essentially, and we've got trying to develop or assist people with individual healing processes has become very difficult in a community where there's ongoing violence, where there's often people with multiple traumas. It's not just dealing with the trauma of one loss, it's multiple losses and multiple insecurities that need to be addressed. It's also a community where there's been kind of ongoing disruptions of economic, political, and social processes, where there have been further retrenchments of miners, and that's, I think, coming specifically at the handover or the purchase of the mine of Sibanye from Lonmin, who immediately after the purchase retrenched a number of people. That has impacted the trust between the community and the hardships experienced in the community. So these are layered processes that one on top of the other just makes this a more intractable problem and deepens the mistrust. On the other hand, and we need to recognize that there have been numerous processes to try and address these problems. As we've heard, the legal process has finally ground out some kind of solutions. There have been some civil claims that have been addressed. At the same time, there are civil claims that are still still not resolved, where they are still not an offer of settlement, and where we still might have to wait for a court hearing to resolve it. There's also in civil claims, both against Ramaphosa and Lonmin, that I think Ms. Korma might be talking to. At the same time, there are memorial events happening, events and annual events kind of hosted by Sibanye and AMCU separately, and accusations kind of going back and forth about who's boycotting which events. So a lack of unity in how these things are addressed. There's also in processes in both by AMCU, by Lonmin, and now by Sibanye, to assist measures to assist the victims, or more directly the families of those who died during the conflict. Assistance with houses, education, jobs at the mine, and in many ways these are quite substantial and effective processes for some, and less so for others. There are also various civil society support programs to assist victims. And these are ongoing, and some of them have borne fruit, and some of them have struggled in a context where there's so little trust. There have also been kind of important broader processes of development and renewal. There's the social and labor plan, which is something that Sibanye, part of their mining contract, their obligations to the community. There's a process that's been started now called the Marikana renewal by Sibanye, trying to get various stakeholders on board to approach these developments in a more collaborative manner. There's again, obviously, municipal developments and services that they provide. And these have been kind of the subject of a lot of criticism of the failure of government, specifically in this community to provide effective services. There's also, and I think very importantly, the documentary films that popularize the stories that have documented people's individual, in families and individual miners' stories. And there's a fair amount of academic analysis and academic engagement. So it's very much still in the public realm. But we need to note that these processes, particularly the legal processes, have been very slow. There seems to be a real lack of commitment to wrap this up, to get finality. And there's also, it appears, ad hoc and uncoordinated. There's kind of been progress on some, but in resistance to finalizing other legal cases. There's also been a lack of clear communication structures and a lack of transparency about many of these initiatives. So it's sometimes so much is happening, but finding out exactly what those processes are and how far they've gone is difficult to assess. And ultimately, there's mistrust and suspicion about their agendas, where in attempts to collaborate are very difficult to get off the ground when people are still so mistrustful of each other's motives. And I think just to conclude, the final issue that has already been raised, but I just want to emphasize, is this particular gap around memorialization, effective memorialization. Where we have, as I said, annual commemorative events. There's a wall of remembrance, there's individual stories that have been collected, but essentially there's still no common space for remembering. There's a general agreement that there needs to be a memorial, or some kind of memorial center at the copy where the massacre happened. And everybody seems to agree on that. And that this would be and could serve as an important space for healing, a space for spiritual reflection, and a space for acknowledgement of the suffering that happened. And that it could also serve as an important in place for rebuilding community, for people to come together. And that I think is seen as a potential place where collaboration can actually happen. But the challenges in taking that forward are also still serious. There's, as been noted, some disputes around the land on which the copy, who the land belongs to, that hopefully can be resolved. And there's an issue of who should coordinate such a collaborative initiative, who can serve as an impartial coordinator of such a process, because there's so little trust in any facilitator or any particular actor taking this forward. And then taking this on would also be a challenge in terms of how one tells the story of what happened. As Nomzamo has made it very clear, there's the official kind of state narrative and there's a counter narrative. And what we clearly still need to achieve is a common public narrative that is not controlled by one party, but that incorporates the stories of the individual victims, that is one that speaks to the South Africa and to the story that we need to hear in order to avoid this happening again. Such a memorial needs to serve as an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. As we've also heard, there's still no acknowledgement from Cyril Ramaphosa in his personal capacity, or from state actors about what they actually did wrong. And ultimately, I think a final point is the question of the state's commitment to such a memorial process. We have a national department that has shown very little interest in what this aspect of our heritage means to the society. That we've got a very active heritage engagement with the apartheid history, which is obviously very appropriate. But the continuities of apartheid as we see it here, the continuity of abuses, it is as if our history ended in '94. But here is clearly an event that we cannot afford to forget. This is an event that if we do not learn the lessons, we will see, as we have seen, continued abuses and a lack of accountability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hugo. Thank you for your presentation. I think it remains to be seen if we'll ever get to that point where we have a common narrative around what has happened in Marikana. I think that's really one of the interesting things that I'm looking forward to see. Andres, I hope now we will be able to hear you. I'm gonna hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, fellow panelists. I hope I can now be heard.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
I really appreciate it. Look, I think the narrative that we are seeing Marikana Massacre as is the same as Seri is seeing it. Because one would remember that we got to Marikana and we got to represent everybody that was in Marikana that was affected by the massacre. Now, by that, it means that we were representing both the injured and the arrested, as well as the members of the families of the deceased people who were shot and killed in the massacre. So we started by representing people that the 279 that were arrested, including the one whose body had been lost in the Kenta that Nomzamo just spoke about, to say there is one person whose body had not been accounted for, and the police just went on and wanted to dispose of him and not disclose that he had passed on in their arrest. Now, immediately after the 279 had been arrested, they were all charged with offenses of murder, assaults, public violence, and many other offenses. But the decision then had to be made as to whether or not we could proceed and represent both the injured and arrested. And ethically, as a lawyer, one cannot go and represent both sides of the fence. You ought to choose one. So we then split into two groups, being one that is led by Advocate Dalimpofu, where we represented the injured and arrested, and the other team, led by Advocate Dumisan Tsebeza, went and represented the deceased families, which is the team in which Nomzamo is. I think everybody else needs to then remember that because of the pressure that we put in to the then President Jacob Zuma, to say that there is no way in which you could seek to keep these people in custody because of this matter, of these matters, simply because we expected the police, if the police were able to mobilize across the whole country, they should be able to do so and make sure that people get bail on an urgent basis, because legally, bail is an urgent matter. For one to be arrested, they cannot be kept in custody simply because the interests of other people are also being looked into. What happens is when you are arrested, your personal interests are looked into. We look into whether or not you are a flight risk as an individual. And if that conclusion can be arrived at for just yourself, you are supposed to be released on bail and brought to court within 48 hours. So all of that did not take place. And we had the state then assist us in making sure that we will get them out. We were putting pressure and saying we're going to be approaching the High Court to get an urgent bail. Now, the then president, through the office of the NDPP, obviously came through to say, let's arrange bail, and that we got. The next process that unfolded was the institution of a commission of inquiry, the Falam Commission of Inquiry. We need to understand that at the time that President Zuma set up the Commission of Inquiry, he had not set the terms of reference to include submissions to be made on behalf of the injured and arrested, which is the survivors of the massacre. So essentially, the Falam Commission of Inquiry, in our view, was set up just for the sake of painting out a narrative that says the miners were just poor and they were just seeking to go all out there, fight out the police and try to prove themselves, which we were able to, one, get onto the Commission of Inquiry, sit and make sure that we make submissions about what really transpired. Because the understanding of what really transpired is that the workers had felt that they were not being taken care of by the employer loanmen. They were not giving increments. They were earning below living standards. And therefore they said, we have been trying all along to go and speak through our union to the employer, but the employer always kept on saying, speak to your union and keep at that. Now they were not getting their increments. They had to go on their own to say, all that we need is a living wage. We are looking at earning at least 12,500, and we believe that will allow us to try and have a better living condition. Now, when they go to the employer sent them back to the union saying that by our understanding, there is a collective agreement in terms of which NUM is supposed to represent you insofar as any labor disputes are concerned. If there's any issue that you need to raise with us as an employer, you do so through your through the union. Now they went and tried to speak to NUM, but before they could even arrive at the office of the National Union of Mine Workers, there were shots fired from NUM's office, and it ended up injuring, seriously so, a lot of our clients, including one that stands out from that day called Mabuya Kulu. Mabuya Kulu had his stomach cut open from that day. And it was that day that the workers then said, it is best for us to disperse, go back home, but the following day, let's retreat and go back to the union and say, but we're not armed here. All that we are seeking is to understand as to what is it that you are achieving insofar as your discussions with the employer are concerned on our remuneration? Because at the time that we go to Marikana, I should tell you that people were earning 3,500 rands, despite the fact that they had been working for Loanmin for 25 years. So it mattered not whether you had been working there for a month or 25 years, you were paid 3.5. Now, for the standoff that ensued, clients then decided we are going to gather at the Kopi. So it is there where the Falam Commission's evidence from the SAPS was that our clients were gathered there, they were holding dangerous weapons, and they were not seeking to engage with the police or the employer. But there is plenty of footage that shows that all that the clients that we represent were saying was that we are not here to fight. We are not here to try and prove our muscles against both the state and the SAPS. All that we seek is to have a one-on-one discussion with our employer and try to get them to pay us a fair living wage, which according to our belief at that time was 12,500 rands. Now, you'd remember also that we started participating in the Commission of Inquiry, which started in Rustenburg without funding, unlike the rest of the legal teams which were before the commission. We went through many, many days, and it was as a result of the submission that we made to Judge Ian Falam at the time, that consider the decisions or the discussions, submissions that we have made thus far, and inform us as to whether or not this commission will come to a fair finding if the terms of reference are not changed to include our view. And Judge Ian Falam agreed with us to say that there is no way in which that commission was going to come close to finding the truth if the words of the survivors of the massacre has not been included in the record of the commission. Now we also said, if you are then going to do that, let's then amend the terms of the reference, which were done. But then having amended the terms of the reference, we spoke to Judge Ian Falam to say, that being the case, it means we need state support because there isn't a parity of arms insofar as preparation for attending the commission is concerned. By that, we meant that state parties like the SAPS were paid for all expenses that they incurred to come to the commission, to participate in the commission, to make copies, to have access to Wi-Fi, to have access to their clients to be transported over. And all of those luxuries, which is a bare necessity insofar as making sure that justice prevails, were not given to us. So we started again with litigation. We had to go to the High Court in Pretoria and ask the court there to say, let the state make means available so that we should be able to consult with our clients and to be able to put fairly their submissions in front of Judge Ian Falam. The High Court did not agree with us, and it sent the matter over to the Constitutional Court in Braamfontein. That is where the judges said, it is best for this matter to be decided by the Pretoria High Court, but the submission that is made or the order that is sought to the effect that the parties must be equal in front of the Falam Commission is agreed to. So therefore, the matter at the end, we won, and the state made some assistance in making sure that we are able to come through and bring our witnesses in front of the commission. The other view that I need to submit is that the SAPS, the South African Police Service, brought from the US a witness called DeRover. Now, DeRover came after a lot of evidence had been led both by us and other teams insofar as the events of the days that preceded the massacre of the 16th. And we were saying, we submit with respect that there are only 3 incidents that caused the massacre. Firstly, it is what transpired on the 9th, which is the day when the workers went through to meet up with NUM. Second is what transpired on the 13th of August, which is the day when Colonel Mpembe then made an order to police to shoot after he had said to our people that bring your weapons to me and I'll make sure that I take you back to the Kopi. On that day, everybody else has had the video, though a lot of it has been cut and nobody else knows who cut the video and for what purpose. To this day, we still remain without the full extent of the video where Mpembe was heard reading and saying or counting to say that I'm going to count from 10 up until 1, and you will not know what will transpire if I get to 1. Now, he never got to count to 1, but all that we know is that going on forward on that video, we see people scattered in the field. We see smoke of tear gas floating all over the place. And there is the days on which Nomzamo has spoken about. So the third incident that we mentioned to have been the ultimate cause of the massacre was the characterization by the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, of the labor dispute to be a criminal act. And he says the police must act with concomitant action. So to this day, we were not at parity insofar as participation in the Falam Commission is concerned. In as much as there might have been an order that says we should be put at least ahead to try and make sure that we are able to consult with our witness. The testimony that we've been able to put up has not been testimony, in my view, that conclusively should be saying Judge Ian Falam has got no option but to agree with our view. Now, DeRover, the one that I had spoken about that had been called by the SAPS to come and testify, stated that the massacre of the nature of Marikana or the extent of Marikana could not take place without political interference. Now, in that aspect, he agrees with us to say there's no way in which we can blame Ria Pierre, the then National Commissioner of Police, for the massacre and leave out Cyril Ramaphosa, who at that point was the non-executive director and shareholder of Lonmin, together with, as well as a National Executive Committee member of the ruling party. The argument that we advance is that the massacre took place as a result of a toxic collusion between state and capital. Somebody with high extents of influence was able to write out to state parties to inform them that we do not see this as a labor dispute. Please perceive this as criminals and go on and treat them as such. Now, it was for that reason that at the end, because Judge Ian Falam did not make any inferences or did not make any recommendations about any other person above the rank of Ria Pierre, that we got instructions that says, proceed and review the Falam Commission's recommendations. So we are now proceeding and making an application to the High Court to get the High Court to review the Falam's, Judge Ian Falam's recommendations, to also include the then National Police Minister, because she had known of the actions of the police prior to the massacre that took place around 3:45 on the 16th of August. Nomzamo has already stated that a day prior to the massacre, the police had made a press briefing. In that press briefing, the message that was sent out was that tomorrow is going to be D-Day. The Marikana dispute is going to come to an end. And now when the then General Mbombo, the then Provincial Commissioner of Northwest, was asked as to what is it that you're going to do to make sure that you get tomorrow's day, the 16th, to be D-Day. She said, we are not at liberty to disclose what's going to happen tomorrow. But we all know that what then happened was that the subordinate police officers who tried to get ambulances to be on standby for the 16th were nicely informed that you don't need to call ambulances for tomorrow's event simply because all that we need now, we need 4 mortuary vans. So therefore, the intention at that point had been very, very clear. And I think I also need to touch the point where we speak about what it means to incite, simply because today, as we sit here in South Africa currently, there is plenty of people who have been arrested for incitement, for having written on Twitter. Now, when one tries to understand the definition of incitement, it's a provocation that is made on one person to go and commit an unlawful offense, or yes, on an unlawful act. Now, we know, and it was considered in front of the Farm Commission by the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, that he wrote an email and sought to characterize the Marikana Massacre. Over and above characterizing it as a criminal act, he went on to say that the police must act with concomitant action. So that, in essence, is the root cause of the massacre as we now know it. Now, when one goes onwards to then speak about the compensations that have been made out of what transpired in Marikana, the narrative which was painted was that our people are criminals, and what we sought to have in litigation that we started against state parties was, including also Cyril Ramaphosa and lawmen, was that they first need to give an apology for what transpired in Marikana. Second, over and above an apology, they need to give compensation. Now, Nomzamo has already stated what has happened insofar as compensation on her part. And we agree with Nomzamo in that the compensation that they seek to have from the state has not been able to go as far as will be able to support the families of the deceased people who were on strike in Marikana. Now, Nomzamo also states that not all the people that she represents were people that were participating in the labor disputes. Like, for example, somebody that was that was hit by a bullet, a stray bullet, has been affected by this, but the state gives them the same attitude of saying that we're not going to compensate you for the rest of your life, whilst expectation was that the person who died would have done so. The person who died would have made sure that they live and are able to be maintained up until such time as they are able to maintain themselves. Now, in our case, we have instituted claims in respect of 2 parts. The first part being the claim for people who have been wrongfully arrested, the 279. We instituted those claims immediately after the charges against them were withdrawn. But then the state went and stated that they were going to settle those claims. Save for that, from 2018 only was the first cent paid towards the first injured and arrested person. The second set of claims that we have are claims on behalf of the injured persons. Now, everybody will remember again that the first volley of bullets that were shot in Marikana were bullets that were shot around a kraal that links up to a road that goes into the squatter camp, which now still stands there. Of the people, of the first grouping of people that were shot, Noki passed on. And the next person that stood next to him in green was Magidiwan, whom to this day we still call the dead man walking. When he fell on that day, he was hit only with 1 bullet. But then the police approached him and spoke to him in derogatory terms, telling them that who do they think they are to be thinking that Muti will protect them from being fired with bullets. He was shot on 8 more times over and above the first time that he was shot. And to this day, he still survives. But of that group that he belongs to, of the injured, none of them has been compensated a cent, despite the fact that they all have needs to go and consult with doctors, they all have needs to consult with lawyers, they all have needs to be transported to and fro, and simply because they still have got bullets lodged in their bodies. So the state's attitude towards the treatment of people in Marikana, it's just too little and too uncaring. Just now, recently, we've had a press briefing made by the state where they alleged that people in Marikana have been compensated. But we know that none of the injured has been paid a cent to this day. We know that there has been commitments made by the president of the country to go and apologize at Marikana. And between then and now, he has not been able to do so. What we should also know is that in the litigation that has been mounted against state parties, there is the scant compensation that I'm talking about that I say has taken place, and we are in discussions year in, year out. Around about the time when the massacre took place, we've got a lot of activity, both from the media houses as well as from the state, going all out there and putting out a media briefing that says we are doing the best to assist the people in Marikana. But this year it was 9 years. Today it's several days into the 10th year. And who knows as to whether or not come the following year, we'll still be having the same story about what transpired in Marikana. I say that the one other thing that we need to look into, it's the memorialization of what transpired in Marikana. The first 2 years after the massacre had taken place, we started having the families as well as the members of the teams that we represent going out to say, this is where all of this started. It started at the first copy, and from the first copy, we walked to the crawl where we were shot, and then thereafter, we were shot execution style after we ran to the second copy. Now, if one goes to Marikana today, you will find that the crawl from which people walked, trying to move away from the police and go home, already has been covered with buildings, shacks that people have built around there. So slowly but surely, there ought to be a voice that comes out strongly and says that, let us at least preserve what has transpired in Marikana. Let's make sure that some memorabilia is built around, one, the crawl, because my view says, in as much as the first and the copy are very, very important about what transpired in Marikana, the crawl itself stands very, very prime insofar as being the first point of contact that the police made with the people that were trying to move away from the copy and go home. And we sit here in the following week, on the 10th of September, we have got a case which is set down for argument in the South Gauteng High Court, where the litigation that we brought against Lon Min, as well as Cyril Ramaphosa in his personal capacity, is supposed to be argued simply because the stance that was taken by government in the litigation that we brought against them has not been adopted by Cyril Ramaphosa and Lon Min. Lon Min and Cyril Ramaphosa says they need to defend themselves. They need to have their views expressed, and they say that they deny having in any way caused the massacre in Marikana. So on the one hand, you have Cyril Ramaphosa stating that he will go and speak to the people in Marikana and apologize. On the papers, which matters the most, you have him stating that he's got some defense to what transpired in Marikana, and therefore there's no way in which he's going to find himself guilty, and he's not even going to apologize. So there is the kind of discussion, I think, that is being heard by the parties, and it is very, very wrong simply because of the poverty, if one may say so, of the people of Marikana. And I take it that for as long as we do not stand up and say it was easy for the then apartheid government to visit people with a massacre like it happened in Marikana. Everybody should know now that the last time that a massacre of the extent of Marikana took place was in 1960 in Sharpeville. Now, it was easy for us to blame the then government. What then stops us from doing the same? And I think if we are to be honest, this ought to be the greatest challenge, simply because people that have been affected back then, 9 years back, are still being affected now. If we are to also try to call out and say people must make sure that they give support, they assist in raising funds to try and create a memorabilia about what really transpired in Marikana, I think the better. We went insofar as over and above the representing people in the Falam Commission. We went and represented them in the Classen Commission of Inquiry. The Classen Commission of Inquiry was set for the purpose of looking into the fitness to hold office of the then National Commissioner of Police, Ria Pierre. And indeed, that commission was not set up to look into the rest of the events that emanated in her heading what ended up being termed the Marikana Massacre. But it found that she had not been a fit candidate for that. Nomzama has already alluded to the fact that state resources has been spent to the tune of over 5 million rands in legal fees to try and protect her in trying to reverse the findings of the Classen Commission of Inquiry. And we know that all of those have been unsuccessful. But if the same extent of support that was given to Riapia was given to the Marikana victims individually, the extent of truth that would have fed out of Marikana would have been much, much more clearer. And I believe that we would have had much more progress insofar as litigating the claims of the people that were affected. Now, the one part that Judge Ian Falam did not touch is the aspect of politicians. What we know is that immediately after the massacre, even during the running of the commission, there were charges of incitement made against the president of the county. Now, there isn't a lot of info that goes out about what has been done about that charge sheet which had been written in and made out. We know that the police officers that were charged were General Mpembe for what transpired on the 16th, the body that had been hidden in the Kenta. And we also know that the court found them not guilty. So we are now still studying the docket to try and understand as to what considerations did the judge make in coming to a conclusion that he can find these police officers not guilty for having concealed a body that had been clear and in their possession from arrest in the Kenta, transported to a police station, and they have not been able to discuss and explain as to what really transpired. Now, the second incident that the NPA is supposed to look into is the events that took place on the 13th when Mr. Mpembe made out an order that says there ought to be shots. That matter is still running, but we are also in discussions again with the NPA about what we need to see happening insofar as all the testimony or all the evidence that we say we have about what transpired in Marikana. So the hope is that at some point, there would be compensation that's given, not just for the injuries, not just for the arrests, not just for losses of support, but also for emotional trauma that existed in the area. Hugo has just stated that you go to Marikana, you think that there had been some recommendations which had been implemented by Judge Ian Falam's report. But you still go there and find that the extent of the number of sheikhs that are there is skyrocketing. So therefore, the extent of poverty that one experiences when one goes to Marikana still grows, despite the fact that there had been an exemplary commission of inquiry that went on and tried to find out the root causes of the labor dispute that caused people to go all out and strike, despite the fact that they've got a labor union. So I have thought and written, and I have tried to understand what is it or what policies should have been in place for something of the extent of Marikana not to take place. And I had thought that economic policies that gave mine workers an opportunity to share in the revenue of the precious metals that they eke out was going to be one policy that assists in making sure that they did not go out on strike. If there had been an agreement that says, Andres, if you work so many hours and you get this bonus simply because you worked beyond what was expected of you, there was no way in which Andres would go on strike simply because he essentially shared in the mining operation that he worked. So I still argue to this day that the nationalization of mines is one key policy that we would have made sure that the massacre that took place in Marikana does not take place again. And I still appeal that parties that are enabled to go and make sure that there is a memorabilia in Marikana, it covers not just the 2 copies, but the crawl, should go on and do so. And any other party that's able to ensure that there is counseling, there is conclusion in litigation insofar as trauma as well as the injuries that are taking place in Marikana. They should join hands with us and make sure that we litigate and come to the end of this. We get orders that state that Cyril Ramaphosa is personally liable. He must compensate for the personal injuries as well as for the losses of life that took place, the loss of support and emotional trauma. And we also make sure that we go again and finalize the claims that relates to the review of the findings of Judge Ian Falam, simply because state parties knew and they had clearly anticipated what was going to transpire in Marikana, simply because they said, let no hospital van come over, but we require a mock van. So I think with that being said, this goes to the submission that I have got to make in this. Thanks a million.
Thank you so much, Andres, for such a comprehensive presentation. I think I just got a chill down my spine when you spoke about the directive that was given that do not bring an ambulance. Instead, start thinking of bringing the morgues to come and pick up, to show that really this was something that was planned in advance. It's really, really scary. We are running, we are already 4 minutes into our time. We are running quite late, but I'm gonna open up just for a few minutes for people who have questions. I'm gonna ask that please raise your hand, and I'm gonna allow you to just ask a few questions. It's not gonna really be long. Issues where you need clarity to our speakers, and please, when you ask your question, can you be clear who the question is directed to? Yeah, any questions? Let me see if I can see people. Yes, I see one hand. Please go ahead and ask your question. Jody? Jody?
So I think the question is in the
Sorry. Yes, okay, Jody, please go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so sorry, I was just writing the question down. because I was not allowed by the system. Quickly, a question for Nomzano and Andres. Well, first of all, thank you all for organizing this. I found it very interesting. So a question for Nomzano and Andres would be, what do you, from your perspective, what should be expected from the companies in terms of accountability? What can we expect, or what should we expect from them? And what do we expect in terms of reparations? Would the effective provision of reparations by the state remove somehow the need for the company to engage in any form of repair? What is your position on that? Thank you all.
Thank you. Can I hand over to Nomzamo and Andres to try and answer the question?
Sure, thank you so much, Tulu. So I think I can speak for the families who, of course, have very strong feelings against Lonmin, and of course, some of them are now employees of SBAD. The one thing that's surprising, Jody, is that Lonmin was the first, in terms of providing reparations, they were the first to actually put up a trust to provide for education for the children and the families of the miners who died. And that happened quite early on. But the one thing that the families wanted, and even I think the miners called for, was that the mine should provide an income, a monthly income to the families so that they could go back and live their lives in the rural areas. The complication now is the fact that Sibanye has taken over from Lonmin. At times they want to express the fact that they were not involved in the massacre, that they've simply bought over Lonmin's mine. But at other times they want to present themselves as willing to invest in the renewal project. The one thing that's been a problem, for instance, so outside of the education for the children and other family members, they've also now offered houses to finish a project that had been started by AMCO, which was to build houses in the 44 families who were killed in that week. And unfortunately, the problem has been the approach taken by Sibanye, which has been to decide what it wants to do and ignore what the victims want. So as it is, the only monument that stands now is a monument that's been put up by Sibanye at the front entrance of their Lonmin Marikana Operations Head Office. And again, that monument was put there against the wishes of the families who wanted to make sure that there's a monument that is at the copy where people died. That monument, again, doesn't recognize the surviving miners. And in the last year, we've been engaged with Sibanye to say, but you must understand the victims of that massacre go beyond the 44 people who died in that week. There are people who survived the massacre. In fact, the thousands that are your employees are victims of the massacre, and there's been that block in getting them to recognize and understand and respond to the cries of the miners themselves, beyond just simply the families. Just to answer you more directly, I don't think that the state's reparations should take the place of those by the mine. The mine itself must repair what it has done, and I think both all the victims have been consistent in calling for that. Andres, can you please add?
Yes, thank you very much. Look, there is a principle of South African law that says the one party that pays, the other is to be absolved. This means when two parties are being sued for one damage, when one party pays for that damage, it means the other may not compensate for the same amount. But that is not the case in this instance, simply because the apology that we're seeking to have from government, from Cyril Ramaphosa, as well as from Lonmin, is different. I should mention now that we have had to amend our papers simply because we had thought Sibanye had taken over the shoes of Lonmin insofar as the claim that took place in their midst was concerned. But Sibanye has distanced itself from the matter, and now we have been compelled to proceed against Lonmin as well as Cyril Ramaphosa. So therefore, insofar as the arrests, it could only be government that compensates for that. Insofar as the injuries, it should be both government, Ramaphosa, and Lonmin that compensates. but we are also claiming for trauma. And we are saying for the bottom part of the claim, still Ramaphosa and Lon Min must still compensate. So therefore, it doesn't mean that for the fact that the government has sought to settle, Lon Min and Ramaphosa are being absolved. Hence, we've got this matter that's coming up in the following week on the 10th of September. And it's there that we are going to be showing the court that the defenses that they are raising, insofar as their claims are concerned, it's flimsy. They cannot be saying government has settled, therefore we are absolved, if they are supposed to be paying for a different kind of damages. Thank you.
Thank you, Nomzamo and Andres. I think I see a question that I think Nomzamo has already kind of like answered, really, that is looking at to say that people in Vanarkop and Marikana also deserve some kind of compensation, right? Because they were affected with all what happened in that 5 months, 9 years ago. So, but I think Nomzamo already spoke to it. And then there is another question, I don't know, I think it's directed at Lon Min or somebody that might know, to say that Lon Min really had a fully fledged, you see now these things, now it's refusing, a fully fledged plan. I think a monument or so. I can't see now the question, oh Lord. Okay, I'm so sorry, I can't find it. If you can you see it? I'm sorry, I'm moving up and down and I'm missing some of the questions.
So look, should I just, I think the issue was that, or the question is about the plan that Lon Min had already developed through consultation with different stakeholders around a memorial for the Kopi. Mm-hmm. And I think there were some concerns around in the ownership of the copy and how that would affect the plans. And I think, and now just to share that Sibanye has started as part of their Marikana renewal process that is now being kind of reinvigorated. That they are looking at, I think as part of that process, a monument or memorial center of some kind for the Kopi. And how that will be is affected by the kind of the land dispute is not clear at this point. So that is, and we're likely to kind of hear quite a bit more about this in the coming few weeks. My sense is they probably want to have something in place by the 10th anniversary of the massacre.
Okay, thank you, Hugo, for that. I think it would have been very nice to have somebody from Sibanye to really speak. Andres, I don't know if you want to come in there. You are muted.
Oh, sorry for that. I think it's not going to assist us that we have people coming through corners to try and speak to clients of ours when they know that we are representing the injured as well as the arrested and the deceased mine workers. So there has been some action that we heard of, which were rumors necessarily, that there was a monument that was planned by Lon Min. There was also a discussion at some point that the municipality was in discussions with the people that were affected in Marikana. But I think for the fact that we know who was affected, for the fact that we know the extent of their affectedness, they ought to talk to them through us, and it's only then that we are able to say there is something sensible that's supposed to be taking place. We know how the massacre took place, and I think it's supposed to be us that knows the kind of massacre that needs to encapsulate the memory that is Marikana. Like, for example, now I'm saying the crawl that people were shot at for the first time is being covered with shacks. I would want to imagine that if the CEO today of Sibanye says, I'm going to erect a monument at Marikana, he'll just go to say, the only thing that's very, very famous out of Marikana is a copy, therefore I'm going to build around the copy. So for the fact that the efforts to try and memorialize Marikana is fragmented. Everybody goes through and tries to do something on their own. It's not going to assist us to make sure that holistically we're able to capture everybody that was affected, and we get them to heal and be able to accept that this is what transpired, even though we know that without whatever actions we have, we are not going to bring back the people that passed or the injuries that people are still reeling from. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think one of the things that I really said that from the beginning when we started is that I really would have loved for us to spend time to think, I think as civil society organizations that are represented here, to think of what are some of the things that we can do together that can really be able to assist in Marikana going forward. I'm gonna allow, I know there are questions, I know there are very interesting things that we still wanna know, but I'm gonna just give 2 or 3 comments on what possibly we can do going forward as we close. I see a hand, David. I'm gonna allow you to ask, hopefully as you bring your question, also maybe if you can have also recommendations of saying what is it that collectively we can do in Marikana in offering some kind of assistance as civil society organization. Over to you, David. David, are you able to have?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
hello?
we can hear you. Yes, we
can thank
hear
you very much. Yeah, sorry, I was trying to type actually questions in the chat box, but I think most of my questions actually were covered by Andres and Nomzamo so far. But what I would like actually to highlight that is very important is the issue of land ownership. The land that you're talking about, it belongs to Babwa Mahali, which is actually vulnerable part and parcel of Babwa Mahali. That land is still actually under claim. I think very soon, before the end of this year, we'll be going back to the Randburg Land Claims Court to finalize the issue of the land. Hence, we're actually part of the talks with the former CEO Ben Matara regarding the issue of the copy. Tentatively, we have agreed that actually a monument must be actually erected at the copy, irrespective of whether the land claim is in process or what. So, but that particular monument is supposed to be erected. But unfortunately, London decided actually to pack their bags and go. Now we are having Sibanye in. I don't know actually whether the talks are still going on or what. But what is important is to ensure that a monument should be erected, because sooner or later we'll be having a lot of sheds surrounding that particular copy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And I think somebody also is asking Andres to say that when you are also saying that we should consider nationalizing the mines, if we cannot trust our state and how we've seen them really respond during the massacre, can we really trust them with the nationalization of the mines? I think that's also one question that is coming through. Are there any way forward? What else can we do? Okay, I think really we've really gone we've really gone over time. So I'm gonna get to a point where we summarize. I'm gonna just hand over to our panelists just to give closing remarks. I saw you, Andres, you wanted to say something, and maybe as you answer that, just also give your closing remarks. And then from there we'll give to Nomzamo and then Hugo, and then we can close today. I think let's just try and respect people's time. Over to you, Andres.
Yes, thank you very much. I think when one speaks about nationalization, one speaks essentially to the fact that an individual will come out to say, I work in the mining space and I am part of the people that have been promised to earn so much if I, as an individual, perform to this extent. So therefore, it is not going to be left to state parties to try and enforce nationalization. Nationalization is essentially supposed to be about individuals deriving benefit from their effort. We know that corruption is endemic, but in that instance, everybody else will have somewhere to go and say that it's either this or the whole workforce stands. And I say, had this been the case, Marikana would have been stopped. The one thing that I also state is that in as much as I stated that the crawl is being erected around, we need to now here decide as to how best do we make sure, because it's supposed to be about individuals also, how best do we make sure that the crawl is not being erected around, that the copies are not being littered on and are not being, they don't have shacks being built on top of them. So all the parties need to come through to the attorneys that represent these people and say, we need one forum, we need to hold hands. We know that the state is not willing to give an apology. We know that Ramaphosa is not close to giving that apology. We know that Lonmin the same, and neither of them are willing to say, let me compensate what transpired in Marikana. So all that we have to do is to rely on the litigation that we have in front of the courts and have the courts order these people to, one, compensate, and two, to offer these apologies. Then thereafter, our own parties will be able to say, out of the little monies that we've earned, let's go and build a monument from what transpired in Marikana. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres. Over to you, Nomzamo.
Thanks, Tulu. I think one of the things that's come out, and I think one of the things that's amazing about Marikana is that in our media, the country stands still on the 16th of August. All of the media outlets cover Marikana. And that happens in the one day in the year. And I think for us, in pushing for justice for Marikana, it's been about us pushing for consistency. So we do want support from other civil society organizations to call for justice, not only on the 16th of August, not only in August, but in every month of the year, to demand for accountability, even to demand for changes in terms of the police. And if that is happening consistently, I think we'll see the response that we saw, at least this year, from government to say, as government, we demand as citizens of this country that you must account for Marikana. We demand that you give us guarantees. We want you to show that you are truly sorry by one, finalizing, as I said, the issue of compensation, but also calling, as I think the community in Marikana is calling on Sibanye not to monopolize the benefits of that mine. I think in the last few weeks, we've been learning about how Sibanye has been able to increase the profitability of the mine in Marikana. So there are many things that we should be doing as civil society, which shouldn't just only happen in August. We should be consistent month in and month out to call for justice, but also be consistent in calling for the injustices that Hugo mentioned are as old as over 100 years ago, and addressing those instead of only decrying Marikana on the 16th of August.
Thank you, Nomzamo. Hugo?
I think and for me, this is always so encouraging to hear in people like Nomzamo and Andres talk about the legal battles that they're fighting, and just to hear the energy and the resolve. And I think that the sense that there's at least a legal voice that is so strong. I think just to emphasize the importance of other processes to accompany and to complement the legal process, specifically around the psychosocial support that is needed. And I think just I've come across in our research people saying, what's been 9 years, kind of surely in psychological support would have been years ago that's taken care of. And to kind of be very clear that in the process of healing for individuals is complex and drawn out. And I think, and as court cases arise, as new disputes emerge, we evoke that trauma again and again and again for these people. The fact that it's been so drawn out makes the healing process so much more complex. And then I think also that individual healing process can only kind of many people, is dependent on the broader community process, the process of memorialization that I think has been very nicely highlighted. And the issues of what needs to be done immediately and the protection of those sites that need to be respected, that need to be preserved. And then how do we work together to have a memorial site that preserves the memory, that is respectful of the individual stories, and that tells a narrative that isn't the state narrative, and also not the mining the mining company narrative. So who facilitates that process? And I think to make sure that the victims and their families have a direct voice in that memorial process, along with all the affected communities, the people who live on that land, who own the land, who historically connected to it, that we have a properly consultative process that is respectful of those different voices. And I think all of us here have a role to play in that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hugo. I think for me, really, I think I agree with what Nomzamo was saying, to say it would really be interesting for us to really continue some of these discussions, right? For them to be ongoing, to not wait until the 10th year commemorations of the massacre to start talking about Marikana. It's like we forget about justice for Marikana throughout the year. Then in August, that's when we want to say something. But I hope we can have these discussions ongoing, just continue having these discussions. I really thought we would spend a lot of time really talking about brainstorming on some of the things, although some of the ideas have been shared, but I think it would have been of value if we had spent a lot of time there. Hopefully we can have part 2 to the Marikana. I'm speaking to CSVR. Hopefully, I hope we can have part 2 of this webinar to really discuss further, because really there's a lot of rich information, a lot of things that have been brought to the fore today that we are learning about. So I just really want to thank everybody for attending this and for allowing us to go almost 30 minutes to eat 30 minutes into your time. I just really want to thank you for that. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to Nomzamo. Thank you to Andres for really giving your time to really talk about some of the work that you have done in Marikana, just to see the passion that you have and the fight for justice for the victims, for the widows, the families that are left behind. I think it's something that is very encouraging. I think if we can have people of your caliber really fighting for the struggle of many, we are going to see change in this country. And with those words, I'd like to say thank you and goodbye. Please enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye.